All right. So how it just got real with a good night. So recap, myheritage DNA.com, ancestry.com, get a hit that I have a half nephew out there. I'm expecting, from what everything I'm reading, I have a half brother, half sister. And at the same time, though, in the back of my head, as I'm finding out with somebody helping me, like maybe it's, maybe it's not. Maybe it's like a one of the unique situations that a distant relative has close DNA because of whatever reason. And I was reading, I went in depth that night, just reading. I was like, oh, it's probably, and if anything, it was one of my dad's brother's kids had a kid and was out there in Germany, because we knew he was in Germany since Vietnam. So, but it got real with a good night. Okay, so when I messaged Becky if she knew who a Gray or Thomas was, she goes, no, I don't. I was like, from the 70s, like, no. I'm like, okay. Still thinking it's a, like joking thinking and messaging my sister like, oh, we might have found something out, but still thinking it's just some error, because at first I was like, oh snap, and then I started reading it and how different things can happen on the website, not website, on the DNA stuff. So she goes, no. So I was like, she calls me, I'm like, hey, my wife's right beside me, I'll call you in the morning, right? Or I'll contact you. She's like, okay. And she says, good night. So this is how good night started it all. So if she would have never said good night, I don't think I would be here right now, right? Because I wouldn't have went that in depth most likely about it. So the reason why good night was the tell that something was up, because growing up, never said good night. Never, right? I do not recall ever, and I have memory recall, right, that we ever said good night. I'm the one who pushed I love you in the family. So with my mother's background growing up, very wealthy family, they just didn't, they showed love by buying from my words from my mother's mouth. My father, Cliff, who I was raised with, showed by distance, right? So like basically the things, us having a very good life in this small town, and him making more money than doctors at the time, because again, he's working in New York City as an engineer, making a lot of money, and we're, reaping the benefits living in a small town in a state nearby, right? Like and he though raised us. I would have never, if I wouldn't have went on, worked the same career he did for a little bit of time, I would have never known how much money he actually made. I knew progressively, we went from one house to another house, to then for 5 or 6 years we lived in this huge historical home, and it's one of the largest square foot homes in a town. But with Cliff, he grew up poor, and it was very much, when I'd ask him, he's like, all I can do is teach you to be poor. So like I was raised that I never went without, but I never thought, it was never crossed my mind if we had something or didn't have something, because that wasn't how anybody was. Where Becky's family was very wealthy, her father being a doctor, and they did very well, so it was very much, and even with her, you didn't really see that type of like, it was very unique that her coming from that background, you could tell it, but in a sense, like it was, you wouldn't have expected it like that with her, that not that she wouldn't have came from that background, but like the way that she acted too, right? So with her not saying goodnight, or with her saying goodnight, we never said goodnight growing up. And it was partially because, again, I started playing sports when I was very young, at 4 years old. I found out years later, actually just a few years ago, that my mother's father, who was a doctor, opened up a building and asked me, I guess one time when I was little, if I liked baseball, and ended up starting a baseball team. And it was started for me, and I was able to play at 4 years old. So now my dad's working away, so he'd come home 2 days a week, if he did come home, because of overtime. And this is when he's starting his career up there, and you can't miss one. If anybody knows anything about the railroad, you have 30 days of leave, you can't even take one while you're moving up the ranks, right? It's just how it was back then. I would see him very little then, right? And then also I had sisters, or he'd come home and he obviously wanted to relax then. So it was like very much growing up, not in a situation that you're going to say goodnight, which sounds weird, where Becky was a social worker, okay? So, and then she also threw her to people, which means the police would call her, and people would call her, so people that were mentally ill, if they were going to be admitted on the 7th floor, she was the person that admitted them on the 7th floor. So we'd spend a lot of nights in the super room, me and my sisters in the back, just either chilling and messing around or falling asleep in the back, because that's pretty much just what our life was at a very young age. And it was very different that me being a boy and pretty much independent at a very young age, and always, you know, doing my own thing back in the like middle of the 80s, when I was like a small child, it was a different time. So you add church on top of that as well. It just wasn't a thing. And like when I'd go in, I would grab something to eat, and she might do her own thing, or my sister might, and it's like just not a situation that anybody says goodnight, right? Like, so that's what I knew when I read that it was about to get interesting, right? So that's my favorite part of this, that if she just wouldn't have texted me goodnight, we wouldn't be here. Because I know I would have been like, yeah, I'm like, it's not that big of a deal. Like, it's just some mess up. Even with the lady helping me, it's like, okay, again, the kid is, these people are related to Cliff's side of the family, right? Like, because I end up finding out they're black. Thank God. Because that would have been a real eye-opener to me if I would end up having this little bit of color, and I'm proud to be blacker than black because I'm black, y'all, and I end up finding out you ain't black at all. You know what I mean? Like, so that was like my first thing. And it's funny, my kids, people that knew me asked it, is he black? I'm like, yeah. So that was like very much like a funny thing, because especially like because of my career, I dress a certain way. I very much can fool people what I am, and it's been interesting. So with her saying that, I knew, okay, like it just got real. And I remember sitting there, it's on. Next morning, call, and I was like, okay. I ended up talking to the person who's been helping me. Something's going on. What's going on? And she's like, well, if this person knows so much, why didn't they? I'm like, well, they didn't. They don't know so much. They're just giving me the information. And I didn't want to tell her, you should have never said goodnight, because that's not something that we do, right? And my family, my kids, we started even hugging in our family, right? Like, we weren't huggers growing up. So like my kids, because I forced to hug them and stuff like that, right? And I think it was great that my family was this way. It might sound weird, because I became a better father and more loving father, because I didn't have those things. I was missing those things in life. And I know some people I grew up with, right? And I'm on my soapbox for defending them, is that had their dad in their life all the time, had a father figure, had a man in their life the entire time, and now have kids that are a piece of crap to their kids, right? Where I'm this person who didn't have that, and instead of being, in a sense, like there was some poor me, right? But it made me at 4 or 5 saying, I want to have kids. And every time anything happened is, I'm not going to do that, right? And it was like, and it wasn't, nothing really bad ever happened to me too, but it was such like a heart-wrenching thing, being an emotional kid, being raised in a church and being raised in small, like Cliff was my dad. He was never there. So anytime I'd face something, like Becky being white, she didn't, and what was different too, though, I'll give it, Cliff couldn't really relate with me because he grew up in an all-black area. Becky being white, she couldn't relate to me because she grew up in an all-white area, and she tried, which made it worse, right? Like, any parents, and this is where I'm kind of getting, so if you have biracial kids, if you aren't the black parent and grew up in an area, right, that's that you face that stuff, you're not gonna relate to them. Same thing with a white person, you're not gonna be related to them. You could say like, oh, I got, like Becky one time, love it, being loving, God bless her. She's like, I know what it's like, and I just got in a real big fight and got jumped by these kids. She's like, I had glasses, so I know it's like being different. I'm like, you can take them glasses out, right? Like, we joke about that stuff now. So, but that was the type of stuff that we ran into. And all because, right, we're here now because she said goodnight. And that's why. Because I grew up in a family. I do not recall ever saying goodnight. I'm in my early 40s right now. And that is not a thing. So, and that's why we're here. So thank goodness to Becky for saying goodnight. Okay? So that's going to be the end of that story. I figured we kind of make a little light of that. But we're here. All because Becky said goodnight. So I'll hop back on here. I had some videos, so I was thinking about kind of remaking them, but I was reviewing them, and I'm just gonna piece it and tell these stories now moving forward, with the same communication. So I hope that you end up going to follow me, because I have a lot of good things come up very fast in the next few weeks, to the people I'm going to get to meet, and to finding out, about my father. And it's still a journey as I go through this, because I have to get to know who he is as well, not just what's on paper. So thanks for listening to me. I'm always going to say this backwards. Give it a like, follow, and subscribe. Thank you guys for tuning in, and it's a lot of interesting, fun stuff coming up. And a lot of you might think I'm like, something's wrong with him, he shouldn't be acting this way. And it's just life. Like, I've had so much stuff happen in my life, and I love it. You know, I could wake up tomorrow and do something completely different in my life, and everyone's gonna be like, what? So thank you for following this journey with me so far.